There is a painting locked inside a vault in Switzerland that has never been shown to the general public, not because it is fragile, not because it is under legal dispute, but because every single person who was given private access to view it during a series of psychological studies in the 1970s reported the same thing afterward. They said they felt like the painting already knew they were coming. A psychiatrist who was part of those studies, a man named Dr. Frederick Holz, wrote in his personal notes that standing in front of it felt less like looking at art and more like being examined by something that had no eyes. He never published those notes. His daughter found them after he died and shared them with a small arts journal in 2009. That journal printed exactly one issue before it went silent. If you could see it right now, you would see this. Lines that seem to possess intention of their own, colors that should not work together, but that create a harmony that honestly hurts to look at. Rostros que parecen mirarte incluso aunque no tengan ojos. And the painting, which was created by a man who spent the last 30 years of his life inside a psychiatric institution, has never left that vault. I want you to stay with me today because we are going to talk about that man, about what he created, and about a question that has quietly divided the art world for over a century. And I promise you that by the end of this video you are going to see creativity itself differently, not slightly differently, fundamentally differently. There is something I am going to tell you toward the middle of this video about how one of these artists actually worked, a detail that almost nobody talks about, and when you hear it, everything else we cover today is going to land in a completely different way. So do not go anywhere yet. Let me take you to a place first. It is 1919, a small town in the Swiss canton of Bern. A man named Adolf Wölfli is sitting alone in a cell in the Waldau psychiatric clinic. He has been there since 1895, 24 years already. He was admitted after a series of violent episodes that the community around him could not understand and could not contain. The doctors at the time had almost no real framework for what was happening inside his mind. Schizophrenia as a clinical concept barely existed in its current form. The treatments available were essentially isolation, routine, and silence. And Wölfli, who had grown up in devastating poverty, who had lost both parents before the age of 10, who spent his entire childhood moving between strangers who did not want him, who worked brutal manual labor from the time he was old enough to be useful, this man in that cell was doing something that nobody at the clinic had ever seen. He was drawing, not sketching, not doodling to pass time. He was constructing entire worlds on paper. Massive, impossibly detailed compositions that covered every single centimeter of the page and then spread outward to newspaper margins, to scraps, to anything he could reach. His doctor, a psychiatrist named Walter Morgenthaler, would later describe walking into Wölfli's room for the first time and feeling physically disoriented by what he saw on the walls. Every surface seemed alive. There was no empty space anywhere. It was as if Wölfli experienced silence the way most people experience a threat, and his response to that threat was to fill everything. Now I want you to hold something in your mind, because we are going to come back to it, and it is going to become the key that unlocks everything else in this story. Wölfli had no training. He had received almost no formal education of any kind. He had never studied art, never visited a museum, never been taught perspective or composition or color theory or any of the technical foundations that trained artists spend years learning, and yet what he created followed rules, not the rules taught in academies, something else entirely, something that art historians are still working to explain. Morgenthaler began seriously documenting Wölfli's work in 1908, 13 years into his stay at the clinic. By that point, Wölfli had already produced an enormous volume of material, and he had also begun writing, not notes, not diary entries, narratives. He was building an autobiography, except it was not a real autobiography in any conventional sense. It was an epic fantasy that spanned thousands of pages in which he, reimagined as a character he called Saint Adolf II, traveled through an invented universe with its own geography, its own music, its own symbols, its own internal languages. He wrote the text himself, drew the illustrations himself, and composed actual musical notation himself, all integrated into the same pages, all part of the same overwhelming unified vision. The entire work, when it was finally compiled after his death, ran to approximately 45 volumes and 25,000 pages. I want to say that again because I need it to be real for you. 25,000 pages, created by one man, inside a psychiatric cell, over roughly 30 years, with almost no materials, no encouragement, no outside influence, and no audience whatsoever. When Morgenthaler published his study of Wölfli in 1921, it caused a quiet revolution in certain circles. It landed in the hands of people who would go on to reshape what the 20th century understood about creativity and about where genuine artistic expression actually comes from. We are going to get there, but first I need to tell you something about Wölfli that the textbooks almost always skip over, because it is the detail that makes everything feel different, and it is the reason I asked you to stay with me at the beginning. Wölfli almost never spoke about his drawings directly. When visitors came to see him, which began happening more frequently after Morgenthaler's publication, he would sometimes perform for them. He had built his own instruments out of paper and would play music he had composed himself, sitting in that cell, completely self-contained. He was described by almost everyone who met him as simultaneously childlike and completely unreachable, warm in certain moments, and then suddenly absent, as if he had stepped through a door that nobody else could perceive. One visitor in the mid-1920s, a painter who had traveled specifically to meet him, spent 2 hours with him. He wrote afterward that he came away feeling that he himself was the one who did not understand the world, not Wölfli. He wrote that Wölfli seemed to be operating from a kind of internal logic, so complete, so self-consistent, so thoroughly worked out, that ordinary rational thinking looked thin by comparison. That is a remarkable thing to say about a man who was legally confined and medically classified as incapable of functioning in society. And it raises a question I do not think has a clean answer, and I want you to genuinely sit with it as we go forward. If a mind builds its own complete and internally consistent universe, with its own rules, its own beauty, its own language, is that mind broken? Or is it building somewhere the rest of us simply cannot follow? The visual language Wölfli developed over those decades was unlike anything that had existed before him. His compositions expand outward from a central point, the way a mandala does, but they are not calm the way mandalas tend to be. They are dense, aggressively, almost violently dense. Faces appear inside geometric patterns. Animals dissolve into architectural structures. Text spirals around human figures. Musical notation runs in borders along every edge. Everything is connected to everything else, and nothing is more important than anything else. A figure at the very center of the composition receives exactly the same obsessive attention as a tiny repeating pattern in the furthest corner of the page. Art critics have used the Latin phrase horror vacui to describe this quality, which means the fear of empty space. But I think that framing misses something essential. It is not anxiety you feel when you look at Wölfli's work. There is something else underneath the density, something that feels almost mathematical, like you are looking at a proof being written in a language you never studied, but that your brain is trying desperately to decode anyway. And the thing that keeps coming up in accounts of people seeing this work for the first time, the thing that makes it different from simply overwhelming visual complexity, is that it feels inevitable, like the lines could not have gone anywhere else, like every mark was the only possible mark. Now I need to connect this to something much larger. What was happening with Wölfli in his cell was not happening in isolation from the rest of the art world. even though Wölfli himself had no idea it was connected. While he was working in Bern, the art world outside was going through one of the most severe identity crises in its entire history. The First World War had just ended. The old systems, the academic traditions, the belief that art meant mastery of classical technique, the assumption that beauty was a fixed and rational category that trained minds could access and untrained minds could not, all of that had been shaken completely apart. Artists across Europe were looking for something new, not just a new style, a new source, a place to draw from that was not contaminated by the rational structures that had just produced industrial-scale slaughter. And the surrealists in particular became convinced that the answer lived in the unconscious mind, in dreams, in automatic and uncontrolled processes, in states where the trained, socially conditioned, self-monitoring brain was bypassed entirely. And when those artists encountered the work of Wölfli and others like him, it was not simply interesting to them, it felt like proof. Like here, in these cells, in these drawings made by people who had been cut off from everything, was a form of expression that was genuinely free in a way that no academically trained artist could ever be. Paul Klee absorbed it. Max Ernst absorbed it. Jean Dubuffet built an entire theory around it. He called it art brut, raw art, art that had not been processed and refined and made acceptable by culture, and he spent decades collecting it and arguing that it represented something more authentic than anything being produced inside the established art world. This work is more authentic than anything in the established world. This is pure, unfiltered human creation. But that could simply be another form of dehumanization. These were not conduits of magic. They were people who were suffering, people who were isolated, people who had no choice about their circumstances, and their work is now displayed in prestigious museums and selling at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars, while the people themselves lived and died with almost nothing and no recognition of any kind. That tension is real, and I do not think you should let either side of it go too easily. Here is what I find most worth thinking about, though. We tend to assume that genuine creativity requires freedom, that you need space and resources and education and the ability to choose your own direction. And yet some of the most astonishing creative output in the history of art was produced inside conditions of total confinement. Not just Wölfli. There is a pattern here that keeps repeating across cases, across decades, across different institutions and different diagnoses and different countries. And that pattern points to something real about how creativity actually functions, which is that it does not always come from having everything available to you. Sometimes it comes from having nothing left to lose. When the ordinary pathways close, something else opens. Not always, not for everyone, but consistently enough that it cannot be explained away as coincidence. And I think that is worth sitting with even if you have never made art in your life, because most of us are not artists in the formal sense, but all of us know the experience of ordinary thinking suddenly stopping and something stranger and more honest starting to come through in its place. The idea that arrives at 3 in the morning, the solution that appears the moment you stop forcing yourself to find it, the thing you say when you have stopped trying to say the right thing. That is the same territory, just at a different scale. Now, I told you at the beginning there was a detail about how Wölfli actually worked that almost nobody mentions, and I want to get to it right now because this is the thing that reframes everything. Most accounts of Wölfli focus entirely on the visual complexity of the finished work, the density, the scale, the obsessive detail, but almost nobody talks about the process itself. Wölfli drew with colored pencils, standard colored pencils, the kind a child would use in school. He received a small weekly allowance from the clinic, and he spent almost all of it on pencils and paper. But here is what matters. He would work on a single composition for months at a time, sometimes longer, and the pressure he applied with those pencils was so extraordinarily consistent maintained with such perfect control across thousands of hours and across the full surface of enormous compositions that conservators describe it as impossible. The layers of color are so evenly distributed that under close examination the surface looks almost mechanically printed, not because he was aiming for that effect, but because his concentration was so total, so completely removed from the self-consciousness that normally interrupts sustained physical work, that his hand achieved a consistency that trained professional artists find genuinely difficult to replicate on purpose. Think about what that means. A man with no formal training, working in a psychiatric cell, with children's colored pencils, produced a level of technical consistency that professionals struggle to match, not because he had more skill in the conventional sense, but because whatever internal noise normally disrupts that kind of sustained focused attention was simply not operating in the same way for him. The filter was different, and every single mark in those 25,000 pages shows it. I need to tell you about one more person before we get to the question I want to leave you with, because this second story adds something to everything we have been building that I think makes it hit harder than anything else I could say. Her name was Emma Hauck. She was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Heidelberg in 1909. She was 30 years old. She had a husband and children waiting for her outside, and her most documented works are not paintings or drawings in any traditional sense. They are letters to her husband, asking him to come and bring her home. Except that Hauck wrote those letters in a way that made them completely impossible to read. She wrote the words so densely, layered so many times over each other on the same surface, that the individual words dissolved entirely into pure texture. The letters became objects. Sheets of paper so completely saturated with overlapping handwriting that they look like something between a drawing and a physical material. The phrase she repeated most often, according to the painstaking analysis of those sheets, was Herzens Schatzi komm, sweetheart come, written thousands of times, over and over and over, until language became image, until the act of writing stopped needing a reader, because it had become something else entirely, something that expressed not information, but the sheer physical weight of wanting. Those letters were never sent. Her husband never came. Emma Hauck died inside that institution in 1920. Her letters are now in the Prinzhorn collection in Heidelberg, one of the most significant archives of art created by psychiatric patients anywhere in the world. They are considered among the most emotionally powerful works in the entire collection, and every time I think about them I return to the same question that I cannot answer cleanly. At what point does an act of pure human need become art? Emma Hauck was not trying to make art. She was trying to go home. She was trying to reach one specific person who never came. But in the process of that reaching, in the unbearable physical repetition of that one phrase, she created something that stops people completely 100 years later, something that communicates more about desperate love and total isolation than most intentional artworks ever manage to. I do not have a resolution for that, but I think the fact that we cannot resolve it cleanly is exactly what makes it worth thinking about. And perhaps the reason why that painting remains in the vault is not because it is fragile. It is because the people who see it cannot help but feel that they already knew it was coming, that it was created in some way for you, for this moment, for now. And the true mystery is not what was painted on that canvas, it is what happens inside of you when you see it. Do you think real creativity requires control? Or do you think the most honest creative work happens precisely at the moment when control disappears? Leave your answer in the comments. Not a quick one. Think about it first.